Hey y'all, it's Paula, just giving a quick heads up that Theoryish will be taking a mid-season break. We will be back with more episodes, more memes, and more special guests. Thanks, and on to the show.
We turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
It is spooky month.
Oh yeah, it's October, by the way. I know you're gonna get this in the future. Paula's wearing colour today. Very strange occurrence.
Yeah, basically, I've had this jumper for about 4 years, and I have worn it before because people have complimented it, because every single time I wear it, people are like, wow, you're wearing colors. And I'm like, yes, I know they exist. And every once in a while, I like them and I buy it, but then I don't wear it because everyone treats it like I'm a freak of nature, including you.
I was just very surprised. I was like, who is that in the distance? That's surely not Paula.
As if my giant hair that's been used and abused by the torrential rain this entire week. I mean, this is where, like, that could happen at any time in England.
Literally, I left the house this morning. It torrentially rained.
No, it's October in England.
It's still too hot though. Global warming is really doing a number on us. Because it's boiling. Also, moved into this new flat. It is hot all the time. It's so hot. Why? Does everyone have their heating on full blast? I don't understand.
We did record last time at your new flat, because she abandoned me. I'm claiming spousal support soon. The courts are on their way. I'm just gonna get like this barrister and just like, I'll give him like a really cute wig. And that's how your papers are gonna get served. No, but all jokes aside, we did do that recording in your house and it was so warm that day.
It's unnecessary. My voice proper went then. It's unnecessary. Welcome to Theoryish, number 1. I always forget.
Buongiorno.
Why? Buongiorno. Yeah. Today we are looking at Linda Nochlin's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?
Yes, and this was a one I pushed for this season. I wanted to introduce Hannah to some more art essays, because it goes into the actual name of the podcast, Theoryish. It utilizes a lot of theory, and it applies what we like to already do, which is take theory and apply it to art pieces or media, and most of art essays are like this. This particular one I had not read in about 10 years. I read it when I was a freshman at university, and it changed me forever. It's one of those essays that I've just always loved and always thought about. And I was a bit nervous coming back to it because I was like, what if this is not as good as I remembered? And guess what, fellow listeners? It was just as good, if not even better.
So, because it's an essay, it's also available online. So if you go in the description, you'll find a link to all the sources we use, and you will be able to look at this for yourself. And it's very short. You can also get paper copies. Like Paula's got a version with quite a few like essays and other bits and pieces from Nochlin.
So if you prefer to read it in like physically, it's actually a little bit easier to find in the US than it was in the UK, which I think is it's another conversation. But Linda Nochlin published a collection of her essays under this book titled Women, Art, and Power and Other Essays by Linda Nochlin. It is the last essay in this book, which I find very interesting as well. She was like, I'm going to save the best for last.
Yeah. So this essay was really interesting because I think I went in, because of the title, really, I went in with a certain perception of what this would be, and it was absolutely not what I thought it would be. And I found that really interesting in a good way, right? It was a lot more nuanced than I expected it to be. I don't know why.
I think because the title, and then it's coming out in the really early 70s. I think it's 1971 when this essay comes out. So this is right at the start of a new feminist wave. It's an extremely catchy title. It is named to elicit a reaction. So when I gave you that essay, you were like, okay. But I'm glad you really liked it.
So Linda Nochlin was born in 1931 and lived until 2017, so not that long ago. Was born in Brooklyn, New York.
Represent.
And was an American feminist art historian. Interestingly, Nochlin has a bachelor's in philosophy from Vassar College, a master's in English from Columbia University, and a doctorate in art history with a focus on realism and Gustave Courbet from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. So she's got a real collective knowledge base, right? Philosophy, English, art history. She goes on to release a kind of number of art historical books just after her doctorate. So she does realism and tradition in art 1848 to 1900 in 1966. And also in 1966, she released another book called Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, 1874 to 1904. So in 1969, she begins teaching a university art history course on women called The Image of Women in the 19th and 20th Centuries. This is one of the first kind of art history courses on women ever. And in 1976, she co-curates with Anne Sutherland Harris a exhibition called Women Artists 1550 to 1950. And she also co-wrote the exhibition catalogue, if anybody's interested. And that was at Los Angeles County Museum of Art. She then gets a professorship at the Graduate School of the City University of New York. And she holds that from 1980 till 1990. Then she writes the book you were referring to, The Women, Art and Power, and Other Essays. And she also teaches at Yale from 1990 till 1992. And then she's professor of modern art at NYU. So she's done a lot of different things. The focus on women, I feel, came a little bit later after the doctorate, because after the doctorate she releases also a book on Courbet. So it's really interesting to see how that interest developed. So the essay we're looking at today, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, was published in Art News in 1971, and it led to actually new research into women artists and raised consciousness regarding the way history is analysed and recorded. It launched a generation of feminist artists and the field of feminist art history, criticism and theory, and it led to changes in curatorial practices in art museums, which began to see more exhibitions on women artists. We haven't read it for today, but she also revisited the paper in something called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists 30 years after. I'll see if I can find it for you, but I was having trouble finding it for myself, so we'll see if I can put it in the sources.
I wanted to also say that this essay was a bit difficult to find in the UK. So where I had no problem accessing it in the States, here our university library did not have a digital copy. And this essay is so important to the field of art history. This isn't some unknown thing. It's mentioned, it's referenced a lot. It's ground zero for a lot of feminist art history. And the reason I have the book version is because that was the only version available. And I thought it was very interesting that I also couldn't really find a lot of Linda Nochlin stuff here in the UK. So it almost even creates this illusion that this is an American context or vision, where I think her essay is surprisingly very flexible and way ahead of its time.
I also just wanted to give a little bit of context on second wave feminism, which is important for Linda Nochlin and where she's kind of coming from. So second wave feminism was from the early 1960s for roughly kind of 2 decades, and then there's third wave feminism in the early 1990s. It's really focused on critiquing like patriarchal and male dominated spaces and institutional issues. It's also drawing attention to things like domestic violence and creating spaces to support people through this time. And it's also about creating like feminist meeting spaces, all these kinds of things. So it's focusing on intersectionality really before the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And intersectionality, we're going to do a whole episode about it. And I say we're going to do because we haven't recorded that yet.
We're coming at you from the past.
Yeah. But essentially, it's thinking about intersectional oppression. So different oppressions that are coming at an individual's. So it's all thinking about how all these oppressions would impact upon one person. And so they're really starting to think about this time, about the experiences of women of colour as well as working class women, and that really comes through kind of in this essay. So
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, this essay is just one of those where, you read the title, you're like, oh no. What am I going to read? And then the question, why are there no great women artists, is repeated throughout the text multiple times. And it's done on purpose because she wants that question to lose value. Because the more she repeats it, the more she emphasizes that, this is not a simple answer question, and this is not just about women. And I think for 1971, that is really ahead of its time. We were mentioning this is like a Judith Butler take.
Yeah, it feels very, we can talk about it kind of in a minute, but her feminism feels both in line with the time but a little bit ahead of its time as well, and we'll kind of take you through that today. But I first wanted to start on her definition of art, mostly because I feel like Paula will be able to tell me more about how she views art, because it was a little bit surprising to me. So I'm going to read you a little bit of a lengthy quote here so you get a sense, and then Paula, you can take us through it a little bit. So, quote, "With the naive idea that art is the direct personal expression of individual emotional experience, a translation of personal life into visual terms. Art is almost never that. Great art never is. The making of art involves a self-consistent language of form, more or less dependent upon, or free from, given temporally defined conventions, schemata, or systems of notion, which have to be learned or worked out, either through teaching, apprenticeship, or a long period of individual experimentation. The language of art is, more materially, embodied in paint and line on canvas or paper, in stone or clay or plastic or metal. It is neither a sob story nor a confidential whisper."
Yeah, so you were a bit confused with that one. And I think you found confusing the use of the word form. So form is, I'm taking this from a very basic dictionary definition, so we can work from that. So form is one of the elements of visual art which pertains to the way shape or physical configuration occupies space. So when you build a statue, that statue occupies space, and it can play with shadow. It can play with a thing called contrapposto, where you lean your leg. It's many different ways of negative and positive space. So what Linda is talking about right now is basically everyone thinks an artist is just born. You just put your feelings onto the canvas and it just happens. And there's some art that's like that, but usually a successful artist is trained. They know exactly what they're doing. Every single strike of the brush is purposeful, or they're purposely trying to create chaos. So before recording, I was showing her different pieces of art that was going around this time. There was a surge in performance art. There was a surge in these very uncommon forms of sculpture. So there's also movements like Gutai, there is land architecture pieces. So things are being done for the creation of art itself. The movement of the paint, the corroding and erosion of material throughout time, and the disintegration. And these things don't look purposeful, but they are. Or they're done in a way that you're supposed to see the thing morph and change. And what she is trying to cement is that there's no such thing as like an accidental artist. There is usually a lot of financial stuff behind it. There is years and years of training. There is sketches. There is studies. There is so much time and effort dedicated into a piece of art. And to take that away from it is sort of to take away the artist's value. There's no strike of genius. It's a strike of study. It's hard work.
Okay, that's interesting, because kind of moving on to where her feminist thoughts are coming from. Mm-hmm. So we're going to spoil some of the essay, but essentially she starts saying that the feminist take in art history up until that point has kind of been going in the wrong direction. So she said the feminist first reaction is to swallow the bait hook, line and sinker, and to attempt to answer the question as it is put, i.e. to dig up examples of worthy or insufficiently appreciated women artists throughout history, which is, to be honest, where I thought she was going to go when I first saw this essay. And then she says, by not questioning the assumptions behind the question, why have there been no great women artists, you reinforce the negative implications behind that question. So she basically says that another way that art historians, especially like feminist art historians, kind of went around answering that question is they would say that women's greatness is different from a man's greatness. Fowler just was like, ugh.
Linda has straight bars throughout the entire essay.
Yeah, so basically she ends up saying that actually women artists and writers have less to do in common with this idea of womanhood and this notion of womanhood, because if that was the case, they would all be drawn to each other. And she says actually they have more to do in common with other artists of their time, and it's more the time period that places them, less so the womanhood or this notion of womanhood, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it's also putting forward a idea of hierarchy and hegemony of art, where to be great is to be male. And even if you are a fantastic artist, you can never be considered or even be looked at, because that means you still have this like flaw. And that little open section also, you know, obviously now with hindsight, is also sort of how the second wave feminism sort of started failing women, because they were trying to lump together all these experiences. You know, there was the anti-porn feminism really late in the 70s that was harming a lot of women that were sex workers and just people that were sex workers in general, because their idea of femininity was contradictory to other people's lifestyles. So I think this is once more another point where Linda is like basically saying this is a very dangerous thing to do. And obviously we're focusing on women artists for the most part, but it was just one of those points where it stuck with me throughout the entire essay.
Mm-hmm. Another point she also brings up that I think is really, really interesting, and it's kind of one of the main points. And this is kind of, I think we mentioned earlier, where I see her akin to Butler, and we'll cover Butler another time, but I feel like these points they feel similar to me. So she says, quote, "No amount of manipulating the historical or critical evidence will alter the situation, nor will accusations of male chauvinistic distortion of history. If there actually were large numbers of hidden great women artists, or if there really should be different standards for women's art as opposed to men's, and one can't have it both ways, then what are the feminists fighting for? If women have in fact achieved the same status as men in art, then the status quo is fine as it is." So she's basically saying that there is a contradiction between both wanting to almost like reach back into the past and drag these women out and be like, well, they were on the same level as these men at the time, when actually it's just not historical, it's not true. Because if that was the case, again, what are we fighting for? If we're fighting for equality, then things were already equal.
Yeah, I don't even know what to add to that. I think you put it so eloquently. I just feel like I'm just sitting here going, yes. You go.
I should be discovering this essay. So she goes on and kind of starts to talk about the ways in which women were prevented throughout history from becoming great artists. And I think this is really important, right? To talk about the ways in which we're not applying greatness retrospectively, we're really just contextualizing things within their time. And I think it's a better way of going about it, yeah.
Yeah, and it's in the essay, this is where the art historical context is extremely important. And I think why we also, in the beginning of this episode, we talked about art and the creation of art. She goes into the art historical expectations of artists. So when you get artists like Michelangelo or like Da Vinci, they had studios, they had apprentices. It is a craft, it is an industry, it is a job. And back then, there were no jobs for women. So the very few women that were able to create a so-called great pieces, I was going to do air quotes and then realize this is an audio format, it's because they had access to these studios. And this is not an easy space to access. Even if your parent or your spouse was a so-called great artist, they would have to allow you to join in their space. And it's something that I think is always missing in these conversations around women artists or even Black artists, Asian artists in the Western world, obviously. It's something that's never discussed. You have to be invited in. It's a club.
Mm-hmm. And this is, when we were talking earlier about second wave feminism and this talk of institutional marginalization, how institutions marginalize people, this is one of the ways. She makes a really interesting point about, she talks about how Picasso was recognized by his father, I believe, his art professor father, for having a gift. But she's saying essentially, would that have happened if Picasso had been a woman? Because the perception of what a woman should have been at that time would not have been in line with this great artist. There are some examples she brings up where this does happen, but again, it's very rare.
And it also, what I was surprised she didn't also mention was class. Had Picasso not been born to an art professor family, would he have been given all these opportunities? And let's not even mention that a lot of Picasso's more famous works later in his life were modeled after African masks. So he was also adopting what he considered an other into his own art. So there was also a lot of cultural appropriation to his art. And these are things that he could get away with because of the time period, the status, the wealth, and also being male.
And really interestingly, she also is making clear throughout, she sees this as a very white male problem, right? She talks about the women problem throughout, but she's no, it's not a women problem. It's a problem with this idea of white masculinity and how that's affecting who is seen as genius, who has access to genius, I guess. Really interestingly, when she's talking about class, she makes this point about aristocracy, which I thought was really, really fascinating. So she says, quote, while the aristocracy has always provided the lion's share of the patronage and the audience for art, as indeed the aristocracy of wealth does even in our more democratic days, it's contributed little beyond amateurish efforts to the creation of art itself. Could it be the little golden nugget genius is missing from the aristocratic makeup in the same way that it's missing from the feminist psyche or the feminine psyche? Or rather, is it not The kind of demands and expectations placed before both aristocrats and women simply made total devotion to professional art production out of the question.
Yeah, because historically, like, you have like people like the Medici family that sponsored all this art, but you don't get a lot of Medici's painting. There were Medicis that painted, but not all of them did. And it is that because when you're an aristocrat, you have certain expectations. That's what's so revolutionary about these like mid to late 19th century painters that are coming from wealthy backgrounds and they're being successful artists. It's very strange for them to sort of start doing all this. And that's not to say that, like, you know, you have to be starving to be an artist. Like, no, artists did well, they got by. Duchamp famously just robbed people their money and just never really made art. Very funny man. But it's a weird privilege to be an artist. And if you come from a family that is known to sell tea or sell coffee, and your family expectation is to sell tea or sell coffee, they're not going to pay for art lessons. They're going to pay for you to go into business school or become a lawyer or do an industry that is of your status. Yeah, I think the comparison to women was very interesting and a bit unexpected.
Yeah, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, but I think this idea of genius also does a disservice to not just women, right? This is one of the ways I see kind of feminist thinking being applied elsewhere, right? So I remember I went into the Van Gogh Museum, I think in Amsterdam, and it's a really amazing museum. They give you a free audio tour, which I really enjoyed. But the audio tour takes you around like various pieces, and it starts talking about mental health, right? And it's like, actually, there's this perception that Van Gogh created because of his mental health, right? Because he was very unwell. He was a genius. He did all this stuff. And they said, actually, if you look at the time period, the points where he was getting better and he was going in institutions that were helping him and all this kind of stuff, the art was produced during those times. Right? And when he was very unwell, it was not produced during those times. And so it's really interesting to think about, like, we have this perception of the genius, the very unwell person, the very tortured artist, right? But that is just not the case. And you get it even now, right? Like with musicians and stuff like this, right?
Well, famously, you know, you got people like Kanye West that's like, the meds stopped me from creating my music. And dare I say, his best music was when he was medicated. But that's my little point. Do not come after me, yay army. But it is a huge issue in simplistic narratives in art history, because that affects so many different people. It affects different things. And it's also this image of like, you have to suffer to produce. And when you make something, even something like this podcast, it is effort. Sometimes we don't feel good. Famously, Hannah has a cold right now, a fresher flu. But there is joy in making. There is love, like, being portrayed, or there's sensation with the canvas. And yeah, I hate the usage of the word genius. I think it is delusional. I think it only does horrible things to other people and to themselves. So it's, yeah, especially people like Van Gogh have always, you know, there's the Doctor Who episode where he's like crying in the gallery, and it's very cringy. I'm sure they meant well, but it's this like fetish for like torture and for sadness. And like, you know, when they say like, oh, he only sold one painting in his life, I'm like, well, yeah, that's part of being the avant-garde. Like, he was just too ahead of the curve. Like, and art appreciates once you're dead. I don't make the rules. Like, it
yeah, because there's no more art being created. Like,
there's limit. Unless you are literally Prince and there's an entire vault of things you've never released. But from that like section, there's so many different ways we can talk about this essay, which is a sign of a good essay.
But I also wanted to talk about her discussion of, if we're talking about institutions and the way they shape the kinds of things we can create and the stuff we can do. She talks about the female nude, which I thought was really interesting. So Paula's excited.
I love her discussion of the female nude because it's such a thing that we're so used to seeing in the West. When you go to any museum, there's a female nude. There's a couple male nudes here and there, but it's predominantly female nudes. So the female nude it's a continuation of institutional access. So she writes about how as late as 1893, lady students were not admitted to life drawing at the Royal Academy in London, and even when they were after that date, the model had to be partially draped, end quote. And she goes on to say that these artists also couldn't draw their own nude bodies, and the usage of a male nude completely not allowed. Meanwhile, the male artists could do whatever the hell they wanted to. And you might be thinking, oh, then they shouldn't just do nudes. It's part of art historical process. When you draw the body, you need to see the body. You need to see how muscles work, how your fat drapes over certain parts of your body, what shadows, how light works with the body, how people stand, how people move. It's extremely important to art education. So to be barred from these studies, she equates it to a doctor not being able to study in a laboratory. And she's absolutely right. It is the study of anatomy. You need to know how the body functions and moves and interacts. And it goes back to form. And her discussion of art is purposeful. So you have to study, you have to nurture this. And people might say, well, I've seen this art and it doesn't even look like a real body. Those are different art movements. Just let it go. Let it go.
I will also say, I think it's hard to appreciate how important these life drawing sessions were, especially now, right? When we have access to so many photographs of people. But I don't do it as often as I should, but I'm quite good at drawing.
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
I'm better at watercolor. I really enjoy watercolor. I need to buy some more, but they're so expensive. But
Christmas.
But I can tell you now, if I'm looking at Paula now, I can see Paula in a very 3D sense. You lose a lot of that 3D-ness when you're looking at a photograph, even a photograph that is taken very well. It loses something that the space in a room gives you. And I've been to life drawing sessions and it's so different. It's so good. So I think they didn't even have the photographs, right? So you're expecting women to become good artists when they're missing out on a fundamental part of their education that men are getting access to.
Yeah, and I'm not a good artist. Why are there no great women artists? Because I'm not one of them. But I have attended life drawings very badly. But there's also, you walk around the person. And it goes back to what you said about 3D. And sometimes you get the most oddest angle and you have to work with it. And it's about working with what you don't want. It is truly a process in learning and studying. It's a big fundamental missing piece. But also, it wasn't just women that were not allowed in these spaces, especially, late 19th century, there's still a thing called racism. And, it also barred other artists from partaking, and it also might even bar darker skinned models, which leads to an inability to paint certain skin tones, show imperfections in flesh. Because when you're darker skinned and you have a bump or some form of, even acne, it looks different on a black body. So there's also that a lot of these nudes are white women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think this is why she's also saying this is a white male thing. Because she wants to make it clear when she's saying men, she's not saying all men, right?
Linda Nochlin hates men. You heard it here first. So the main portion of the essay was this. And then it cut off 2 sections, which was questions of the nude. And then there's a couple more sections that we're going to briefly just fly by. One of them is called The Lady's Accomplishments. And in this one, she writes about how women's art was also seen as like hobbyist art. It wasn't really considered real art. She also went into a bit of like feminist Marxism, where I'm going to do a direct quote. So for me, it's on page 166, if you're in my version. And it's, now as in the 19th century, amateurism and the lack of real commitment, as well as snobbery and emphasis on chick on the part of women on their artistic hobbies, feeds the contempt of the successful, professionally committed man who's engaged in quote-unquote real work, and can, with certain justice, point to the wife's lack of seriousness in her artistic activities. For such men, the real work of women is only that which directly or indirectly serves the family. Any other commitments falls under the rubric of diversion, selfishness, egomania, or, at the unspoken extreme, castration. And she really just nails it in the head. If a woman was also too good at the art, it would put a strain in their heterosexual relationship. So it had to be seen as a hobby, as a craft. That's why a lot of weaving pieces and things that fall under quote-unquote decorative arts are at times not even seen as real art pieces. So it's also not only subjecting women to fall under a very patriarchal definition of art, but the things that they make are not considered worthy of being called art. They're called a craft, they're called a hobby, they're called a skill.
So she ends then by saying that, I don't know, the ending's quite interesting.
Yeah, it just ends.
Yeah, it just ends. And it essentially says, like, women have essentially succeeded in spite of all of this stuff. So there's 2 quotes. There's one that says, but if the artist in question happens to be a woman, 1,000 years of guilt, self-doubt and objecthood have been added to the undeniable difficulties of being an artist in the modern world. And then she also says, it is only by adopting, however covertly, the masculine attributes of single-mindedness, concentration, tenaciousness, and absorption in ideas and craftsmanship for their own sake that women have exceeded and continue to succeed in the world of art. Which I think is an interesting ending.
Yeah, well, because this is also the rise of women artists. So, you're hitting the 20th century and you have people like Helena Frankenthaler. So performance art is becoming a thing and women are very successful in performance art. You have people like, she's still alive, artists like Marina Abramovich, sort of seizing the spotlight and really highlighting and showcasing what women can do. And then there's more radical artists like the Guerrilla Girls that did pieces to highlight the absence of women's art within spaces like the Met, the MoMA, the big art institutions. So this essay is sort of, I think it's purposely left open because she doesn't want to conclude with there will never be any great women artists, but at the same time she kind of hints towards that. She doesn't want like a female Picasso. She wants just that artist. So she doesn't want to be like, oh, the great Abramovich, she's like, I don't want that. I think it should change. I think the entire structure of art needs to change. And I want to personally end on how the 70s, especially the beginning of the 70s, was this battle with patriarchy. And it just popped into my head as we were discussing and recording. But I don't think it's surprising that 2 years after this essay, you have in tennis, the battle of the sexes with Billie Jean King, just dominating Bobby Riggs, a male tennis player, and cementing equal pay for women in tennis. So it's the beginning of a lot of these very revolutionary moments in female representation. And I think that's a little bit why she left it open-ended. I think she was hoping for more. So for media, we didn't want to do Linda Nochlin fanfiction. I will not do my bestie that way. So instead, we're choosing art pieces, or I chose an art piece. I don't know what the hell you did. So for my piece, I decided to use Merla Latterman Eucalyptus. I've never actually said her name out loud before. So if it's completely mispronounced, I'm so sorry, girl. Love you. She's a performance artist from the 70s, and she had these 4 different maintenance art pieces. So one of them is the Hartford washing tracks maintenance outside and inside. So basically, for a number of weeks, she would clean the steps of the museum that she was not allowed to put her art in.
Amazing.
But it goes into like far deeper. So like it becomes like a bit like petty. It is petty. But what I found really fascinating about this art piece is just how grueling it looks. So it is about also how women's work is not seen as work. So like the expectations of cleaning the house, of maintenance, and she's doing this like dressed quite nicely. And, you know, she's covered in water. She's like scrubbing the floor, and she's doing this every day. And she's trying to highlight the work people do that goes underrepresented. And when she turns it into art piece is when people actually pay attention. It's the things that just exist on the sidelines that you're expected to do, that you do for each other, and sort of the hierarchy be within that as well, where because you're maintaining something, you're a lowercased. So it's a fascinating piece. There's many different pieces that she goes. There's also go out / undressing to go in. So it's her removing and putting on clothes, basically just how much work women go into presenting themselves to look nice for others. Then there's also I make maintenance art 1 hour every day, and it's just the documentation of all the maintenance things she does in her house. She's a fascinating artist. Yeah, touch sanitation. I'm not very familiar with that one, so I'm going to leave it there. We're going to link this in the show notes. But I remember this was one of those pieces that stuck with me when I first read the essay. So, you know, I'm saying this like very briefly because these are like pieces of art I haven't really looked at in a couple years. And it was just really nice to connect the essay to the art that I studied. And I think it's also a very different way of exploring theory. So hopefully y'all really liked this. I'm kind of ending this way because I know that Hannah is about to go off. I don't know what she's up to.
So I didn't know who to choose. There was an artist I wanted to use, but could not remember the name, could not find the person. So then I was like, okay, I've been playing a lot of video games recently, and I really have been enjoying them. Especially, I've been playing Horizon Zero Dawn and Horizon Forbidden West, which has a female main character, right? And there's lots of like queer undertones. It's really interesting. And so I've known for the past few years, especially there was like controversies a few years ago around the place of women in video games, right? And I feel like that has gotten slightly better. Not all the way, right? You still get a lot of depictions that are very shallow or just women dressed very provocatively, but then you also have things like The Last of Us 2, which again, female main character, really interesting and important. And so I was like, okay, great, I'm gonna find some video game artists. And when I tell you, I couldn't find a single female video game artist. I was looking for so long. And then I found this Wikipedia page with women in video game production is very short. Like, considering like how big video games are as an industry.
Why are there no great women video game creators?
Literally. And I was like, what the hell is going on? So then I eventually have found 2 people, but I want us to really think now about these structural issues haven't gone away, especially when you're thinking about new media. You know, these structural issues really carried on, and I don't know a huge amount about this. I know tiny bits. It's kind of like a side interest of mine, but I think it's important to keep these things in mind because, yeah, like out of those women, how many women of color do you have? How many women with disabilities? How many women of lower classes? Like, how did these women get into these spaces? And so, yeah, I think I think it's interesting and important to actually think about when she leaves it off at a point of being like, I don't know if there will ever be great women artists. What is happening today? I'm going to leave, again, in the show notes, some links and stuff like this. But 2 artists I found was one, Ikumi Nakamura, who's a Japanese video game artist and director who worked on The Evil Within and The Evil Within 2, Ghostwire Tokyo, Bayonetta. And I like Nakamura because there was this whole article about her on Game Informer, and it was so interesting because she's like so into horror as well. Like, she talks about how she grew up, and some of the stuff she says about herself was like she fell from the stairs one day when she was a child and she lost like the lower part of her face. And she talks about it like really gruesomely. Yeah. She's hardcore.
Yeah, I was like metal, but also wow.
And you can see like some of the art and stuff she did. I think she's also done stuff for Resident Evil Okami, which is a really beautiful like.
Oh, I've seen that.
Yeah. And she's done all this stuff, so she's super cool, super interesting. So I think I recommend like going to give it a look. And then I also found an artist called Gen Z, which is JENZEE, not in the Gen Z type of way.
I already love her.
So she's an art director for Supergiant Games, and she worked on a game called Hades.
I think you've told me about this. Basically, I do the How Do You Do Fellow Kids with Hannah because I know nothing about video games.
But look at some of the art in this game. Wait, that's so good. So I recommend, I don't know too much about them, but I think it's really worth checking out and maybe having to think about.
Yeah, I like that. It was just like a refreshing essay. Like, you didn't come out of it just depressed. You came out of it a little bit hopeful, and you can tell it's the beginning of the second wave because there's still hope. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for listening. Gaslight Gatekeep Girl Boss.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information. And please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.